Hi, my name is Benedict for Highhertz. In this video we're looking at the new Hornet plugins ADDA, A-D-D-A. So the first question has to be, well, what is it? Obviously it's not a Swedish pop band, it's far more of an Italo disco thing, Severino. Go do your research. What it stands for, what the name stands for is AD, so analog to digital, so an ADC, which we see here, and a DA, so digital analog converter, so a DAC. So the main thrust of the program is to convert from, in our DAW, analog to digital, and then from digital to analog. So it's an ADC and a DAC in one box. He says you've got an analog input and output. I'd probably rather rename them as real-world stages at the beginning and the end of the process. Everything can be switched in and out, so it's fairly modular in that sense. And you may well be asking yourself, why? Why would I want that? And that's a really fair question, and if you're asking that, it's entirely probable that you do not need this. My opinion on these things, because I'm not big on bit crushing, is that if you've got a use for it, you've got a use for it. If you don't have a use for it, it's probably totally irrelevant. These sorts of things are not like a compressor where every studio should have one. It's one of those things that you're going to want it or need it if you need it. The reason that most people are going to give as to why, and they'll often be very finger wavy about it, is like, oh, so you can emulate old samplers and old synths and old drum machines. So Akai samplers, loathed them. I was an EMU guy, it sounded so much nicer. And of course synths like the Casio CZs and SQ1s and what have you. And drum machines. Drum machines were famous because the really early drum machines were pretty ragged. If you listen to, and I mentioned High Energy, Italo Disco, there's a lot of early digital drum machinery on there. Now, the thing that people will say is that to make records sound great, you've got to have that vintage vibe. And you know what? You could have swapped all of the instruments out of, because we're talking Italo Disco at the moment, Hey Hey Guy, or any fancy song, or a Patrick Cowley track. You could swap them out for plugins, and you'd still essentially have the same amazing feel that you do. Whereas if you look at Retrowave, or whatever it's called this week, it doesn't sound the same, even though they pretend it does, because the mindset is so different. Not only in the composition and the construction of the music, but very much in the way it's mixed. I mean, Retro Blaze is mixed radically differently from the way that High Energy was mixed, even though they claim to be doing the same thing. So simply grabbing a Korg DDD1 and putting it into a modern record and saying, now it sounds good, is an absurdity. So that's why I'm not personally overly fussed on these kinds of things. But if it's a path you want to look at, this is worth looking at. Also compare and contrast to Tal's device, which I reviewed a while ago. I'll put the picture up there. I'm not going to get into comparing them because it's up to you what people are going to want out of this ADC DAC kind of thing is going to be so personal. The idea that this is going to be able to emulate a DDD1 or an RX5 or a S950 or whatever is, I think, rather ridiculous. But can you get some of the flavour? Well, maybe. We'll have a quick look at that. I have got this running. Switch it out. Switch it in. We do have dropouts because it's a demo. And I'm not necessarily noticing a big difference. The sound here is using a couple of phase distortion oscillators in Thor, which in my impression is probably the most accurate soft synth CZ emulation. No, don't need to write to tell me about the Arturia. It sounds like an Arturia. It doesn't sound or feel like a CZ to me. If you want to check out what a real CZ sounds like, then I'll show you a picky of the guy. He does lots of videos with his CZs, and they sound elegant. They don't sound like Arturias. Up to you. If you like the Arturia sound, go get it, but don't think you're getting a CZ. This, in theory, my first interest would be, can I more CZify this sound? The basic oscillator form does a pretty reasonable job. Now, different people will tell you different things. Something tried to tell me that it was, I think it was 8-bit 35K. Well, it was sure never this noisy. If we punch this out, well, we're not feeding noise in, but we've still got a huge amount of noise. So, but I believe that it was a 16-bit device. And it would have had some kind of interpolation. What was not uncommon with the CZs, which is part of what is difficult and very difficult for me, is that their DACs apparently were prone to wandering off true. When they are true, they actually sound very smooth. But when they wander off true, they get all kinds of interesting characters to them, and I believe that mine had a very interesting character for a CZ. It had been knocked to the floor several times. Somebody once fell out of an upstairs window, put his foot through my window, kicked my CZ onto the floor about 7 o'clock in the morning. I was asleep, and I was like... and then a cat dropped it on the floor as well. But it was always a bit of an interesting sounding instrument, and there was something funny and digital about it, so I think its DAC was out of alignment. This is all anecdotal, but I believe them to be a 16-bit with a fairly high, but not 44K conversion. Does this make this seem more like a CZ? I don't think so. I've played with different rates, and I'm not feeling it. While this gets a little bit there, it's one of those things that you've got to have to sort of go by feel. If I were to swap to an analog model, switch this out. I tried to have a very similar sort of waveform. We can swap to a... pop this back in. So we are getting an interesting sound, and this does remind me of some early, what we would call cheap or low bit sample rate sorts of synths. So the adder is doing its job pretty well here in terms of getting me to a CZ. I don't feel like I'm going to get there because I've gone backwards and forwards, and I've had some things that it always sounds horrible to me in headphones, but in real speakers I sort of think, yeah, okay. But I think you've got to apply a certain amount of suck it and see. Let's have a look at Hornet and their pricing. So Hornet, I really like Hornet's analog stage. I use the tube on almost every mix. It had this wonderful sparkle to things, so I'm predisposed to liking Hornet because of that. I think that if the tool works for you, their pricing is very good, or his pricing is very good. In this case, you're looking at €11.99. In US dollars, that's currently about 13.3, just under 20 Australian dollars for the one Australian who's probably watching this. Bit crusher and resampler for vintage digital. Okay, as I say, I've possibly got some argument with that in the sense that I think maybe it's a bogus thing, but yes, his logic is good. There's a lot of product from Hornet. I have had quite a few issues with it, and I'm having some issues with this in Reason. They seem to be fewer issues in other doors. I was very interested in his Total EQ, I think it's called. A pretty simple, easy looking EQ with dynamics for like $12 or so or whatever it is, but it wouldn't run properly, and I haven't tried it again recently. Otherwise, I probably would have had it, and I would have been running it instead of QRange. But it is a thing to be aware of if you're in a door that can be funny with VST. Make sure you really test the Hornet plugins before committing to them, simply because it is possible that there are some bugs or difficulties with your thing. That said, where I have reported bugs, including with this, I started and then hit some very nasty unworkable results, showed them over in the KVR forum, and overnight it was acknowledged like, oh yeah, sorry, we buggered that up with an update. And I think it was the same day or the next day there was an update, and it was solved, or basically solved. But I think his current structure may have a little bit of an incompatibility with Reason, but he's an interesting developer who's a little on the technical side, but his workflow within his plugins is good. I think if you can contrast workflow with Tal's plugin to this is immediately easier to see and understand what's going on. That's a win. I'd rather something that has less knobs and buttons or less functions. I don't care how many knobs and buttons it's got, but less functions with a good workflow than something like with trillions of features and a poor workflow. But these are pretty well featured. So very cheap, affordable plugins. We'll run through my good and bad, and then we'll walk through the device below. What's good? Well, the idea does appeal to me in the sense of being able to get, particularly if I could get a Casio CZ sound from it. I didn't feel like I got it from Tal, and I don't feel like I'm getting it here. At times I think I get nice sounds, but oddly enough, I think the Casio and this just don't seem to sit very nicely. All the phase distortion oscillators in there and this don't feel like they sit nicely. I'm more likely to feel like I'm getting the kind of sound that I might go, oh, that's kind of cool, from feeding it an analogy kind of thing. But the idea has some appeal, even though mostly I'm not sold on it. The preset things, I had a bit of a frustration with Tal's because he sort of didn't really have much in the way of preset things. This, rather than having a completely whatever number you type in, has some preset bit depths and preset sample rates. They appear rational, but they don't cover everything. If I were to try to say, okay, well, I'm going to try and emulate my Emax 2 or even my Emax 1, I can't do it, because Emax 1 was 28 and 2 was 39, I think. So some more numbers and some more models, or even being able to sort of say, this is this device emulated here, could be nice. I don't know whether many people are going to be saying, I want to emulate this particular model. It is clear to use. As I said, Hornet's approach to their workflow is generally really clear. That's a thing that I do like a lot about their product range. We do need to run through some bads, as I've covered it. His current product range, the new styles of interfaces do seem to be a little bit more buggy. But, as I say, where I reported it, it was fixed straight away. How fast he would fix something you might encounter, I don't know, but there are some things that are still problematic. If I link I/O here, and this is in Reason, and I'm not sure that it's happening elsewhere, this one starts to judder, and that adds some problems. If we reset it and don't link I/Os, then it seems to be fine. So it's workable, aroundable, But I think there may be a little bit of ironing out that needs to happen, especially if you're in a DAW that that's a little fussy about how it handles VST. I do find that it tends to be incredibly mild or really messed up, and not a lot in between. This is to some extent the nature of DA and AD conversion, in the sense that there's a lot to it, and if you start pulling bits and pieces, like cherry picking the bits you're going to do, then it is entirely possible that you're going to get bad math. And bad math is just going to sound like this. And some people, that's exactly the sound they're going to be looking for. Other people, not so keen. I'm not so keen. But I'm always going to be balanced that way. There are a few interpolation modes, as you've seen me use. Cubic, as I've written here, it drinks more than Dracula. At the moment, interestingly enough, it's surprisingly low. But I think when you go up to higher bit rates, sample rates, yep, it's maxed my DSP on an i7, fairly recent i7. So you kind of got to watch it a little bit. The cubic mode can be heavy. We'll look at that a little bit more as we go. But one of those things, try it, see how it fits with what you're trying to achieve. All right, we shall go into the walkthrough bit, so we'll fold him up, and we will use drums, because I know that most of you are just going to go, drums! Alrighty. Here is a set of drums, semi-randomly played by Beatmap. And nothing's running at the moment. So we'll look at the input section. It has the ability to go up and down, and that's what it does. Double click will send it back to default. You can type things in, or you can even, oh, that's not allowing me to, oh, I was sure you could drag. No matter, but it functions just fine. There's then the saturation. Now this is really pretty mild. I did test it with a sine wave, and yeah, if you pop this to 100 and this to 100 and turn up the levels, you can start to see a little bit of, so it's not dramatic. It's not a Neve console that's been left in the rain for 12 years. It is mild, but nonetheless, it is probably reasonably consistent with reasonable quality gear. I'm not going to say that I'm hearing any difference. And then you can add in hiss. Again, it's relatively mild. In theory, we probably should be pushing everything up to close to 0 dB, and that's part of what your input gain's for. And obviously, if we've done the link I/O thing, then we would end up with something like this. And we're starting to hear some distortion. Some of that may be coming from saturation. Some of that is probably more just coming from good old-fashioned clipping. But we can do mild driving here, should we so desire. We've then got our ADC, our analog to digital converter. So this is like if we were sampling something. Or if, in my case, I was trying to take my synth and make it feel like a CZ, we'd need to put it into the feel of a CZ, which means we'd need to do an AD conversion first, which is why we sort of do AD, DA all in one go. There is nothing to stop you from saying, okay, I'm going to run this plugin twice. Once at the beginning to do an AD conversion, do all my processing, and then run the plugin again as a DA to go out. That works on the assumption, of course, that the device that you are emulating, assuming you're emulating something, had those processes, effects, what have you, built into its chain. And if we're talking bit crushy, old-fashioned, early to mid-80s kinds of devices, good luck with that. You might have had an analog chorus after the DAC, and you'd turn it off as fast as you could because it would hiss terribly. Casio CZ3000, anyone. So the AD converter, you've got bit depth. It goes from 24 down to 4. So as I say, they seem generally pretty reasonable. 11's an odd one. But let's assume 16-bit. And then, of course, your sample rate, which is set from 44 down to 4. And drums. This is the sound that people are going to be wanting. That should be the same. We are pushing pretty hard. And notice how you get very definite tones at certain numbers. But at 22 you kind of don't. We've then got interpolation. Interpolation basically is doing the math between our sample points. When people say digital sucks, it's from a lack of understanding and or a lack of interpolation. If we don't do any math to smooth that curve between this sample and that sample, obviously it's going to sound terrible, especially if we have a very low sample rate. Sure, we're going to have some true impressive nastiness, but if we do even a little bit of interpolation, gruesome nastiness goes away. Notice when we drop the bit depth, mostly it just gets noisy and the dynamic range starts to feel crushed, because that's literally what happens. If we go down to really low, let's just get rid of that hiss and saturation. That's okay. You've got to work out where noise is coming from, and it's not always easy to tell. If we back off this level, hear how it just becomes more and more noise? We lose definition. And if we drive too hard, we actually start to get the sound we were after back again. So bit depth really is just volume range. How much of that can we handle? If we drop this, let's go down to a lower rate. Sounds pretty good. Sounds terrible. If we use a high sample rate, sounds very good. Sounds like poop. High bit rate. Sounds good regardless. So our bit depth is merely our dynamic range. And if you want that old Public Enemy kind of sound, then you go to a relatively low bit depth and you push your input gain. And that will give you the feeling that the sound is sort of good, but at the same time it's going to sound sort of bad. Obviously saturation, as I say, this is just real world. It's just adding a little bit more to the sound that's now being taken by the analog digital converter. And this is very realistic because especially older equipment or cheap, affordable equipment, then there tended to be quite a bit of noise and just saturation distortion that was going on. So you can choose your bit depth, which will be how is this going to respond to level, and your sample rate, which is how is this going to respond to frequency. And seems like this is having that issue of it's still stealing my spacebar. That's why I keep getting stuck with the music playing. And then this interpolation. We can interpolate not at all, in which case it sounds atrocious, but that's that bit crushy sound that people want. Sample and hold, which is a nice, rough kind of interpolation. Linear, which is generally pretty good. And then, of course, cubic, which we won't get into, which is good, but it is prone to drinking harder than Dracula. So just be aware. Of course, you can turn any of these off. Anti-aliasing, I was interested with the CZ approach. How is this going to go with anti-aliasing off? Because those things aliased like a bastard. Anything out there were a 4-octave keyboard, so anything in sort of octave 4 was just, it was chewed up. There was a lot of bounce back in those things, and you just had to accept that. If you wanted a high string sound, then there was going to be the brighter you wanted that sound, the more bounce back there was going to be. This doesn't seem to emulate that at all. It just kind of sounds bad. And in some situations, with the anti-aliasing off, you will get just a whine. Sometimes I even have it switch in and out. Just like, obviously that's some kind of a mismatch in the math, especially seeing I've got my output. Actually, I have no output, so it doesn't really matter. But this is just part of it. It's a bit, as I say, it can be mild or messed up. Sometimes it can feel a little bit random. You probably need to understand how this works. Otherwise, you're just going to be like, I do that, and now it sounds like crap. There isn't a sort of like how much crapness I want to dial in. You can just move the switches and it sounds like crap or okay. And sometimes it's hard to get that point where you're like, that's the kind of crap I want. Then we've got our DA converter. Let's go 12-bit A, sample and hold with some anti-aliasing. DA converter. In theory, our DA converter should match our AD. But there are situations where they may not, in which case you may decide that you want to mismatch to get some noise coming out of this thing. But in theory, that's the way it should sit. And dither level, well, dither is just noise, it's adding noise so that you don't end up with problems in the sample creating noise. Judder. So yes, it's fine, it defaults to 90 dB. I don't understand why you would want to change that. Okay, fair enough, it's there, it looks cool. I've never really understood why we would want to meddle with dither as such. And again, no need to write in and tell me, because I've read lots of these things. I understand how dithering is useful if you're going from 24-bit to 16-bit or something like that. You don't want that mismatch of bits to become jagged and give you nasty noise like whatever I was having before. So fair enough, it gives that little bit of noise, which just means that you end up with smooth and pleasant. So DA conversion, and then we've got another one of these real-world thingies on the other end, where if we've pushed our gain, we can pull it back here, and of course apply our saturation again and some hiss. So clean. Converted and reconverted and what have you. And if that's the sound you're after, okay, it's brilliant. I just rarely go for that kind of sound, so I'm just being fair to say, hey, I'm unlikely to be like amazeballs. There are a few other things that it does. as is not uncommon for Hornet these days. You've got oversample modes, which are 2, 4, and auto. So it works out what your sample rate is and then applies either 2 times or 4 times. Because I'm running at 1644, it auto actually is times 4. You will notice that oversampling will have an impact on how things sound. Let's go a bit nasty. So you can have changes in the way things sound from your oversampling. That's a thing I guess you can use creatively, or just wonder kind of why it does that. Okay, it's that hiss on the input. You've got to be into this kind of stuff to really make the most of it, and or be chasing that, oh my, that sounds bad, kind of a thing if you're chasing this sort of thing. But in terms of an A-B, okay, if you want that, then it's probably great. Some of the noises here just don't resemble what I used to get. But again, remember, I had Emaxes, and EMU's converters were notably different and better than the Akai ones. People liked the Akai ones probably because they sounded like MP3s, whereas the EMUs, despite their odd numbers, sounded very beautiful. So I have a different point of view on what samplers sound like from most people, because to me a sampler sounded good in its own way. We can link the I/O as we saw here, and I'm not doing it simply because there are bugs, and the same with, you've got a pre and post emphasis. So if we take our thing here, we can set a frequency amount and then add or subtract some dBs to it, and if they're linked, then you'll do the same on the other side. There isn't a turn this section on or off, but that does change our sound a little bit. So by pushing this up, pulling this down, we do end up with a smoother sound. So if you're chasing an emulation kind of feel, then don't be afraid to look into that. Generally, you would use that linked. I'm just not, because it's doing the judder thing. And while I could do this review in Reaper, I would rather not do the review at all, because I feel so uncomfortable in the environment, which is going to impact on how I feel about the device I'm using and the review. I want to be fair about this, and that is that personally I just don't see myself ever using it, but it is more logical in its workflow than Tal's device. It has perhaps less knobs and buttons, but its simple logic makes perfect sense, and if you know what you're looking for and how to get there, or are just prepared to put in the time to, what happens when I do this, what happens when I do that, the combination of things, that you can get cool results. I mean, I think this is pretty cool. Clean, Reason stuff tends to be very, very clean, and giving it a bit of an edge, especially if we play with things here. Like you can do this unevenly, or go the other way around, or just use it to, so if you want that even more crispy feel, then you can do things like that. And that's where the right kind of people are going to find this as a very, very cool device for achieving certain effects. So no way am I saying that I think it's a bad device, other than a little bit of bugginess, which hopefully will get ironed out. I think it is a cool device, and definitely if this is your first ADDA experience, definitely a lot more approachable than Tal's device. You got to get out there and try this one. I've got no way of saying to you what's good or bad about it. But again, I do say that I did find it quite interesting putting this onto. Let's turn him out of Let's just expand this so it feels a little bit more stringy. So it definitely cheapens, roughs up, nastifies the sound, and when you get the right combination, you can get some pretty cool sort of things from it. Just don't feel like I'm hitting it right with the CZ thing, but I'm so funny and emotive about the CZ that it may be a poor thing to do, but nonetheless, as a potential user, that would be the first thing that I would look to be like, can I get CZ feel from this? But I'm just not the guy to use these kinds of things. It's incredibly rare that you'll hear bit crushing in any of my work. I don't have the client base for it, and nor do I really have the personal interest in my own personal music. I mean, there are times where I use elements of it, but it's not like a thing for me. And again, I'm of the mindset that's saying, oh, well, if I get a Korg DDD1 and put it in my track, then suddenly I'll be like, Kitten Knight Rider. It's not how you get there. There's a whole other mindset, which I'm far more of. So when I mix, people go, but it sounds... It's like, yeah, because I'm a traditionalist. I work that way. And therefore, I don't sound like EDM or whatever, because I don't work that way. So there's often that mismatch between people, who go get their stuff mixed, and there's like a rock guy who wants a nice rock mix and then goes to somebody who's only ever mixed EDM and just doesn't have the mindset to see things differently. This is a little bit of that. All right, if you have any questions, pop them on down below, preferably after hitting subscribe. If you're interested, go try the device. Also go watch the video on Tal's similar-ish sort of unit. They're not neck and neck with each other, but they're playing in the same ballpark, so it's reasonable to compare one to another. But please do your own comparisons. Please don't ask me, well, how do I think it compares, because I haven't put them head-to-head. I like each in certain ways. Benedict for higher hertz. Don't forget there's higherhertz.com as well, not to mention our massive catalogue of videos that we have here. Get out there, have fun.